I still remember the day everything started to feel different. My neighborhood had always been peaceful, the kind where kids played outside, neighbors waved from their porches, and we all looked out for each other. But that changed the moment. Our homeowners association, HOA, announced new regulations. At first, it seemed harmless. A neatly printed notice slipped under my door. Updated HOA policies, effective immediately. I didn't think much of it. Just another set of minor adjustments, right? But then, the fines started rolling in. $50 for having my trash cans visible, $100 for a minor crack in my driveway, $250 for violating community aesthetics. Whatever that meant. I thought it was just me, until my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Carter, knocked on my door one evening, clutching a letter in her wrinkled hands. "They're fining me for my flower pots," she said, her voice shaking. "Can you believe that? I've had those pots for 15 years. That was the first red flag. The second came when I tried to reach out to the HOA board. The usual friendly members were gone, replaced by a group of self-important suit-wearing officers I had never seen before. They called themselves the new compliance enforcers. Their leader, a man named Mr. Whitaker, barely looked up from his papers when I entered the office. "Sir, I just wanted to understand why I'm being fined." "Read the guidelines," he interrupted, sliding a thick rule book across the desk. "If you break them, you pay." His tone was sharp, dismissive, like he knew he was in charge and I was just another name on his list. That's when the uneasy feeling settled in. Something was wrong. This wasn't just about rules. It was about power, and I had a sinking suspicion that these so-called officers were running the show for their own benefit. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, and they had no idea who they were messing with. I wish I could say the fines were the worst of it, but they weren't. Not even close. At first I thought the new HOA officers were just overzealous, maybe trying too hard to improve the neighborhood. But soon their rules turned from annoying to downright ridiculous. One morning I saw Mr. Johnston, the elderly man who lived 3 houses down, arguing with one of the officers on his front lawn. His crime? Leaving his car parked in his own driveway overnight. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. That's always been allowed. It's in the HOA bylaws, he protested, waving an old rule book. The officer, a stocky man in a cheap blazer, crossed his arms and smirked. Not anymore. The board revised that policy last week. Didn't you read the notice? Johnston scoffed. I never got a... Then maybe you should check your mailbox more often. The officer flicked a yellow violation notice into Johnston's chest like it was trash. Fine is due by Friday, no exceptions. I watched the whole thing from my porch, my hands clenched into fists. Something was wrong. These people weren't just enforcing rules, they were hunting for violations. And then, the rumors started. People were being told to pay their fines directly in cash at the HOA office. No receipts, no records. One neighbor mentioned that after she refused to pay an absurd $500 fee for a lawn height violation, someone slashed her tires overnight. The HOA had always been transparent before, but now? No one was allowed to attend. No meeting, minutes, no discussions, just rules, fines, and consequences. That's when I decided I needed answers. I marched into the HOA office one afternoon, determination outweighing the anxiety twisting in my gut. The office, once run by friendly neighborhood volunteers, had been transformed. The blinds were always shut, the furniture sterile, the air thick with something unspoken. Behind the front desk sat Mr. Whitaker, the smug leader of this circus. He looked up at me with the same disinterested glare as before. "Can I help you?" I tossed my latest fine onto his desk. "Yeah, you can explain this." He barely glanced at it. "Failure to remove seasonal decorations by the deadline? $200. I stared at him. "It's January. The deadline has always been February." Whitaker smirked. "New policy. Effective last week." I exhaled slowly, trying to control my temper. "Where are these new policies coming from? Who approved them?" He leaned forward slightly, tapping the desk with a pen. "The board." "Who's on the board?" I shot back. His smirk faded. That information is not public. That stopped me cold. Not public? The HOA board had always been elected. We knew their names, their addresses. Now they were anonymous? I took a step closer. I checked with the county records office. There haven't been any official changes. Or to the HOA leadership. So tell me, who exactly are you people? For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Annoyance? Amusement? Maybe a bit of both. Then Whitaker did something that sent a chill down my spine. He laughed, a slow, knowing chuckle as he leaned back in his chair. You should be careful what you dig into, neighbor. I knew then that this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. Something bigger was at play, and I had just made myself a problem for the wrong people. I should have let it go. That's what any reasonable person would have done. But after my confrontation with Whitaker, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The smugness in his voice, the secrecy around the board, the ridiculous fines. It wasn't just about money. This was control. So I did what any stubborn, pissed-off homeowner would do. I started digging. First, I went to the county records office, figuring I'd pull up the official HOA registration documents. Every legitimate HOA had to file reports, leadership changes, and financial records with the county. Except ours hadn't. No updates, no leadership changes, no meeting minutes for the past 6 months. That made no sense. By law, those records had to be filed. So where were they? A woman behind the counter, noticing my confusion, leaned over and whispered, "You're not the first person to ask about that." That sent a chill down my spine. When I got back home, I started knocking on doors. If other people were questioning the HOA, I needed to find them. Mr. Johnston, the man who got fined for parking in his own driveway, let me inside his house and lowered his voice. I tried to fight them. Sent letters, made calls, nothing. Then one morning my mailbox was smashed in. No cameras caught anything. Mrs. Carter, the sweet elderly woman who'd been fined for her flower pots, told me she had received a warning letter after she complained. An anonymous note in her mailbox that simply read, "Stay in line, things can get worse." And then there was Kyle, the guy who lived at the end of the block. A younger guy, ex-military. He didn't scare easily. They tried to tow my car for a made-up violation, he told me, arms crossed. I told them to get a warrant. Next morning, my tires were slashed. It was the same pattern. People who pushed back got punished. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a shady HOA. This was a racket. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were using fear to keep people in line, and I was about to push my luck even further. Late that night, I took a drive past the HOA office. It was a tiny, unassuming building in the community center, one that was supposed to be run by volunteers, but now it had security cameras. And strangely, the lights were still on. Curiosity got the best of me. I parked a block away and walked up the side of the building, staying in the shadows. Peeking through the window, I saw Whitaker and 2 other men counting stacks of cash. My stomach dropped. This wasn't HOA money. There was no paperwork, no checks, just bundles of bills being stuffed into envelopes. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture when, crack, I froze. Behind me, the gravel shifted. Someone was there, watching me. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I turned just enough to see a shadow moving near the corner of the building. I had seconds to react. I stuffed my phone in my pocket and walked away like I was just passing through. My legs burned with the urge to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. As I reached my car, a voice cut through the darkness. Out for a late-night stroll? I turned to see one of Whitaker's officers standing under a streetlight, arms crossed, smirking. I forced a casual shrug. Couldn't sleep. His smirk didn't fade. Maybe you should stop asking so many questions. People who do tend to regret it. I didn't reply. I just got in my car and drove home, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had proof now, but they knew I was watching, and something told me they weren't going to let it slide. I didn't sleep. That night? Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment outside the HOA office, the stacks of cash, the shadow watching me, the smug warning from one of Whitaker's officers. They knew I was on to them, and if they were bold enough to threaten homeowners, vandalize property, and pocket money, I had to assume they wouldn't think twice about coming after me. But fear wasn't an option. I needed proof. Real proof. By morning, I had a plan. I wasn't going to storm into the HOA office demanding answers. They'd just laugh in my face. I needed something solid, something they couldn't deny. I started with the HOA's official records, or at least what was publicly available. Most of it was fluff, meeting agendas, maintenance notices, a long-winded welcome letter from the board. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. Every HOA decision required board members to sign off, but the last 5 policy changes, every signature looked exactly the same. No variation, no natural handwriting differences, a clear case of forgery. The HOA was supposed to report its budget, where money was coming from and how it was being spent, except there were no reports for the past 6 months. Gone. Erased. A lien is a legal claim against a homeowner for unpaid dues. Normally this happens if someone refuses to pay for months, but I found 3 recent cases where homeowners were given liens within weeks of a single missed payment. Illegal. This wasn't mismanagement. This was fraud. I wasn't sure what to do next, until I got a call. It was Mrs. Holloway, an elderly woman who had been on the HOA board for over a decade, until she mysteriously resigned 6 months ago. "I heard you've been asking questions," she said softly. "Meet me at the park. No phones." That last part sent a chill through me. No phones. She was scared. When I got there, she looked around nervously before sitting beside me on a bench. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "They forced us out," she whispered. "Me, the old board, all of us. They told us they were taking the HOA in a new direction." I frowned. "Who's they?" She swallowed hard. "Whitaker. And a man named Reynolds." That was a new name. Reynolds. Mrs. Holloway continued. "We didn't realize what was happening at first. They said they were helping, streamlining things. But then, they started pushing us out, one by one. First, they made up reasons to suspend board members. Then they changed voting rules. By the time we realized what they were doing, they controlled everything." I stared at her, anger bubbling in my chest. "You're telling me they staged a hostile takeover?" She nodded. "And they're using the HOA to launder money." I exhaled sharply. "That explains the missing financials, the cash payments, the fake liens." She lowered her voice even more. "They're extorting homeowners, forcing them into debt, then threatening foreclosure. They want people desperate, vulnerable, because then they can buy up properties for dirt cheap." My fists clenched. This wasn't just about greed. This was about control. I turned to her. "If we expose them, will you back me up?" She hesitated. Then she nodded. "I'll testify. But we need real evidence." I already knew what I had to do. We had to catch them in the act. I couldn't just walk into the HOA office and demand files. They'd see me coming a mile away. I needed to be smart. Step 1. Gather witnesses. I needed more homeowners willing to speak out. Mrs. Holloway was a start, but I needed at least 3 more people to confirm what was happening. Step 2. Find the money trail. If they were laundering money, there had to be a paper trail. Whether it was bank transfers, unreported income, or missing dues, I had to find it. Step 3. Go public fast. The moment they realized we were onto them, they'd try to bury everything. I needed to take this to law enforcement, the local news, anyone who could make noise. But first, I needed to get inside that office. I needed proof they couldn't erase, and I knew exactly how to get it. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. This was bigger. This was war. I never expected so many people to show up. The night before, I had quietly spread the word, knocking on doors, making hushed phone calls, telling everyone what I had uncovered. Some people hesitated, scared of retaliation, but others, they were ready to fight back. By the time we gathered outside the HOA office the next evening, there were at least 40 of us, homeowners, young and old, standing together in the flickering glow of porch lights, their faces set with quiet determination. This wasn't just about fines anymore. This was about justice, and we weren't leaving without answers. The moment we knocked, Whitaker opened the door, his smirk instantly replaced by surprise when he saw the crowd. Behind him, 2 of his officers stood stiff, their eyes darting between us. I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "We need to talk." Whitaker forced a chuckle. "This isn't how HOA matters are handled. If you have concerns, you can schedule a meeting. We're done with your games." I cut him off. "We know about the fake fines, the forged signatures, the missing money, and the liens you illegally placed on people's homes." A ripple of anger spread through the crowd. Whitaker's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation." I pulled a thick folder from my bag. "Evidence. We have everything. The fraudulent paperwork, the county records showing no legal board changes, the homeowners who've been threatened, fined, and harassed." His eyes darkened, but before he could respond, a voice from the crowd rang out. Mrs. Holloway, the former HOA board member, stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "I was on the real board before you pushed us out. You're not HOA officers. You're criminals." Whitaker's jaw clenched. The two men behind him shifted uneasily. They weren't expecting this. The neighborhood had been scared of them for months. But now, they were scared of us. Whitaker let out a slow breath and crossed his arms. "All right," he said, his voice smooth but forced. "You all need to calm down." That's when he tried to turn it around on us. "You think you know how an HOA works? Do you have any idea how difficult it is to maintain a community like this? We took over because the old board was incompetent. We streamlined the rules. We improved efficiency. And yes, sometimes tough decisions have to be made, but everything we've done has been legal." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some people hesitated. That was his tactic. Gaslight, manipulate, act like he was in control. But not this time. I took a step forward. "If everything is legal, why are there no financial reports? Why are board meetings closed? Why are people being fined for made-up rules?" He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "Why are you demanding cash payments?" Silence. He had no answer. Then, out of nowhere, one of his officers snapped. "Enough of this." The taller one, Reynolds, shoved forward, his face twisted in fury. "You think you can just waltz in here and tell us how to run things? This neighborhood belongs to us now. If you don't like it, you can get the hell out." The crowd gasped. Whitaker turned on Reynolds, hissing, "Shut up." But it was too late. I narrowed my eyes. "Belongs to you?" And then it clicked. The liens, the aggressive fines, the intimidation. They weren't just scamming us. They were trying to force people out. "You're not running an HOA," I said, realization dawning. "You're running a property scam." Whitaker's expression twitched. He was losing control. Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman who had been fined for her flower pots, suddenly gasped. "Oh my God! The vacant houses." Everyone turned to her. "I noticed it last week," she stammered. "Some of the homes where people moved out, they're still empty. No new buyers, no new renters." A sick feeling settled in my stomach. They weren't just stealing money. They were stealing homes. Whitaker knew the crowd had turned. His confidence cracked, but he still tried one last time. "This is slander," he spat. "If you people think you can just overthrow us, you've got another thing coming. We have legal authority over this neighborhood." "No, you don't." A new voice cut through the night. I turned and saw police officers stepping through the crowd, lights flashing, badges gleaming. Whitaker's face went pale. I exhaled sharply. I had called the county fraud department earlier that day, gave them the evidence, told them about the forged documents, and now they were here to take out the trash. One of the officers stepped up. "Mr. Whitaker, Mr. Reynolds, you're under arrest for fraud, illegal property liens, and extortion." The neighborhood erupted in cheers. I turned to Mrs. Holloway. Her eyes were shining. It was over. We had won. Even after everything, the fake fines, the intimidation, the blatant corruption, a part of me still wondered if we'd actually win. Crooks like Whitaker and Reynolds, they thrived on fear, on the idea that no one would dare to challenge them. But they had made one crucial mistake. They underestimated us. The morning after our confrontation at the HOA office, I drove straight to the county fraud division with a thick folder of evidence. Financial inconsistencies, fake signatures, illegally placed liens, everything. At first, The officer behind the desk skimmed the papers with mild disinterest. Then he saw the forged signatures, then the missing financial reports, then the cash collection logs I had photographed through the HOA office window. His expression changed. He leaned forward, rereading everything carefully. "Where did you get all this?" he finally asked. I took a deep breath. "We've been living it." By the time I finished explaining, the officer wasn't just listening. He was furious. "This isn't just HOA mismanagement," he muttered. "This is organized fraud." Those were the magic words. Within hours, law enforcement was involved. The real HOA legal team, the one that had been sidelined when Whitaker and his gang took over, was notified. It turned out they had been trying to investigate, but were being stonewalled. Now, with the County Fraud Division backing us, that wall was about to come crashing down. Later that evening, I stood at my window, heart pounding as the flashing red and blue lights rolled into the neighborhood. 3 police cruisers, a county investigator's car, and 2 suits I assumed were HOA legal representatives. Within minutes, a group of officers stormed into the HOA office. The entire neighborhood started coming outside, gathering in small clusters, whispering in hushed tones. We weren't the ones afraid anymore. For the first time, I saw Whitaker and Reynolds truly rattled. They had spent months bullying and threatening us, but now it was their turn to feel powerless. I watched from a distance as an investigator waved a folder of documents in Whitaker's face. The same documents I had turned in. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. Whitaker was trying to deny everything, shaking, his head pointing fingers, spinning some desperate story about misunderstandings. But then an officer gestured to the office, motioning for them to unlock it. Reynolds hesitated. Too long. Another officer muttered something into his radio. Within seconds, police were escorting them inside. They were trapped, and they knew it. For a moment, everything was still. And then, chaos. Suddenly, Reynolds shoved one of the officers aside and bolted for the back door. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he tore across the parking lot, sprinting toward his car like a man possessed. Whitaker! The coward just stood there, mouth gaping, as if he hadn't actually believed it would come to this. I couldn't help but mutter under my breath, "Wow, real professional." But karma didn't make Reynolds wait long. He had almost reached his car, his hand outstretched for the door handle, when 3 officers tackled him to the pavement. The thud of him hitting the asphalt was satisfying. Even more satisfying, watching Whitaker's face drain of color as officers turned to him and said, "You're coming with us too." Handcuffs, the Miranda rights, and then the realization that this was really happening. Whitaker wasn't in charge anymore. We were. As the police cars pulled away, the neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Then slowly, cheers started. People hugged, laughed, shook hands. We had done it. I turned to Mrs. Holloway, the former board member who had tears in her eyes. "It's over," I said, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding for months. She smiled, nodding. "No, it's just beginning. Because now we had a neighborhood to rebuild." For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The nightmare was finally over. Whitaker and Reynolds were in handcuffs. Their scam had unraveled in front of the entire neighborhood, and law enforcement had enough evidence to bury them in legal trouble for years. Or so I thought. Because what happened next? None of us saw it coming. The morning after the arrests, I expected relief, maybe even celebration. Instead, I woke up to an official-looking letter taped to my front door. It was from a law firm, and it wasn't just me. Every homeowner got one. I tore mine open and skimmed the contents. My stomach twisted as I reached the final line. The HOA board remains legally intact. Any changes must go through proper legal channels. I read it again. Then again. What the hell did that mean? I stormed over to Mrs. Holloway's house, my hands shaking. She was already outside, reading her own letter, her face pale. "They can't be serious," I blurted out. She swallowed hard. "They are." And then she said the 2 words that nearly knocked me off my feet. "There's another." I blinked. "Another what?" She looked up at me, eyes filled with dread. "Another board member." We had been so focused on Whitaker and Reynolds, so sure they were the masterminds, that we missed something crucial. There was a third name on the fake HOA documents. And that person? They hadn't been arrested. Why? Because unlike Whitaker and Reynolds, this one was smart. They hadn't signed fraudulent financial records. They hadn't been the one physically enforcing the scam. They had just sat quietly in the background, letting others do the dirty work. Legally, they were still on the board, and because of some obscure clause buried in the HOA bylaws, that meant the HOA still technically existed, and they still had control. Within hours, the remaining board member, a man named Douglas Hale, sent out a neighborhood-wide notice. His message was short, smug, and infuriating. The HOA will continue operations as usual. A formal review of policies will be conducted. All fines and liens remain in place unless legally disputed. My blood boiled. The audacity. This man had sat back and let Whitaker and Reynolds ruin lives, and now he was swooping in to take control. Mrs. Holloway exhaled sharply. He's stalling. If he keeps the HOA running just long enough, he can argue that it never actually dissolved. That means every fine, every lien, every stolen dollar stays on the books. I clenched my fists. And if we don't stop him? She didn't need to answer. I already knew. All of this, the fight, the evidence, the arrests, would be for nothing. Desperate, we called the County Fraud Division again, but their hands were tied. Hale hasn't technically committed a crime, they said. Yet, that's when I had an idea. If the legal system wouldn't shut him down, maybe public pressure would. I made a few phone calls, and within hours, our neighborhood was swarmed with something Hale never expected. The media local news crews showed up, cameras rolling as homeowners stood on their porches telling their stories. Mrs. Carter, sobbing as she explained how she had almost lost her home. Kyle, the ex-military guy, showing reporters the vandalism he endured after standing up to the HOA. And then me, handing the reporter a stack of documents, pointing right at the HOA office as I said, "This isn't a homeowners association. It's a criminal enterprise." Within hours, the coverage spread. The county commissioner issued a public statement. A state investigator opened a new case. And just like that, Hale's little loophole collapsed. That evening, Hale sent out one last letter. This time, his tone was different. Panicked. Defeated. I hereby resign from the HOA board, effective immediately. All prior HOA policies are suspended pending community review. Translation? He knew he was next, and he wanted out before the law came knocking. The neighborhood erupted in cheers. We weren't under their control anymore. Not Whitaker, not Reynolds, not Hale. For the first time in a long time, we were finally free. The next week, we held a real HOA meeting. A fair one. We voted on new leadership. We wiped out every fine, every lien, every bogus policy that had been used to exploit us, and as I sat there listening to people talk, not in fear but in relief, I realized something. We had won. Not because we had lawyers, not because we had money, but because we refused to back down. And when regular people stand together against corruption, even the biggest crooks don't stand a chance. For the first time in what felt like forever, our neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. No more intimidation letters taped to doors. No more fines for ridiculous violations. No more corrupt enforcers lurking around looking for their next victim. We had fought. We had won. But the battle had left scars. At our first official HOA meeting, the room was packed. But there was no arguing, no threats, no smug power plays. People spoke cautiously at first, as if waiting for someone to slam a gavel and tell them their opinions didn't matter. Old habits die hard, I guess. But as the meeting went on, voices grew stronger. Ideas flowed. Real concerns were addressed, not as orders, but as discussions. For the first time in a long time, the HOA was actually working for us. And that was the biggest victory of all. Over the next few months, everything changed. Families who had considered moving out decided to stay. People started planting flowers, repainting fences, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. Block parties returned, kids played outside again, and neighbors who had once been strangers became allies. Fear had ruled our streets for months. But now, there was life again. One evening as I stood on my porch, Mrs. Carter walked by with her little dog trotting beside her. She paused, smiling. "I almost left, you know. she said softly. But I'm glad I didn't. I smiled back. Me too. Looking back, I realized something. Corruption doesn't always come with sirens and flashing lights. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, under the guise of rules and authority. It takes root in places where people are too afraid or too exhausted to fight back. And that's exactly why people like Whitaker and Reynolds thought they could get away with it. They counted on us staying silent. But we didn't. We stood together, we fought back, and we won, because at the end of the day, no one is in charge unless we let them be. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Your support means the world.